Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads. We've got for you our live stream and Q&A for tonight, the first day of October here in California. We are going to be talking about the very little news that there is. There's basically nothing. There's one big rumor that we have to discuss, and it actually, of course, as it always does every week, came out the day after we did our last live stream. So we didn't get to talk about it, but it is a week old at this point. But we are going to discuss the rumor of the Mandalorian and Grogu possibly being the end of the Mandalorian series, both TV and movies. And then we're going to also talk about Outlaws sales and the way that has shaken up Ubisoft over the last month. We are now over a month since Outlaws came out. It's kind of crazy that it's been that long, but we're over a month and we're going to discuss some of those numbers and all of that. But as per usual, when it is a slow news week, and this is definitely the slowest news week we have had yet in this post Acolyte run, it is going to be a show dominated by your guys' chat. So send in your chats to the comment section, or, I mean, obviously through the chat room. And if you're watching this on replay, you can send in your stuff in the comments section and join us every single Tuesday to talk about the latest in Star Wars news, and we will take your questions. So send in your questions, send in your comments, anything you'd like to discuss, any topics of interest. It doesn't have to be Star Wars related. This is, of course, Ask Us Anything format. And so you are the ones that get to control the way this discussion and this chat goes. But as usual, let's start off with the main topic. And our main topic, and really the only topic that is super interesting this week, is this Mandalorian and Grogu rumor. So this did come out last week on Wednesday, September 25th, the day after we did our stream. And it comes from an insider, a Hollywood insider named Daniel Richtman, who's also known as Daniel RPK on, I believe, Twitter and any of the other sources. I don't keep up with leakers and insiders very often. But this person is saying that they have heard that the Mandalorian and Grogu is not just Mandalorian season 4, but that Mandalorian season 4 is not going to be happening. And then not only will that not be happening, but this might be the end of the Mandalorian series as we know it. Din Djarin will still show up in everything as we would expect. Hopefully he doesn't become the main character of all these other shows like he has for Boba Fett. But he'll show up in it, possibly more Boba Fett stuff in the future. He'll show up in Ahsoka. He'll show up in Thrawn or whatever they do following this movie for a Thrawn movie. That is the rumor, at least. When you hear this rumor, Sanak, what do you make of it? And do you really buy it all? Because I don't think I really do, that this is the end of The Mandalorian.
I don't buy it entirely, but I can see it kind of happening. I think no matter how much people want to say they love Mando season 3 or they hate it, right? It did come 2 something years after the really, really strong finale that Mando season 2 presented, which arguably could have just been the end of The Mandalorian and that story, right? And I don't think season 3 is inherently bad or anything. I still quite like it a bit. I still edge it out just a little bit over some of the episodes in season 1 for me just because I do like the culmination of a lot of things. But I can't deny that Book of Boba Fett and the choices made there really, really diverted the story in the path that we all kind of expecting for this series. I think even after Book of Boba Fett, we're like, no, no, like season 3 will be able to work with that, make something rich out of it, maybe take some episodes with Din Djarin and to start off the season and then tie that in or something. But no, the, as always, the Mandoverse has always kind of played this very linear, basic storyline that is easy to follow for the average audience. That was one of their biggest swings, and it was a definite miss because a lot of people are like, "Why is Grogu back at the start of season 3?" So hearing that, then hearing that season 4 could happen, maybe doesn't happen. Oh, it's being converted to this movie. I feel like we've been barreling toward this conclusion that the story that we know from the Mando series is complete, and I don't mind it. I think it ends fine. It's a solid, happy note, and I think you take away all the fluff of season 3 and parts of season 1, and It's solid, right? It's good, but again, this story doesn't end. The promise of the end of season 3, which we were hoping for season 4, was that he's gonna be contracted out on New Republic jobs and start becoming a little bit less of a bit player in his corner of the galaxy, but and that just happened to have Luke come in and all that, but actually become a little bit more notable. Now have Grogu become a bit more of a player as a proper apprentice. Obviously, we don't know if Gideon is alive or dead, Giancarlo is always saying, "No, no, that was a clone, my mustache wasn't there," this and that, so maybe they're trying to, like, semi-reboot part of the story here with the Mandalorian Grogu film. And then that's our season 4. So what comes after? Honestly, I don't know, because I always thought that whatever's gonna happen with season 4 was gonna be an introduction to a lot of the Imperial threat and the Remnant building up a little bit more of the groundwork for this supposed heir to the Empire adaptation that was gonna happen. And I think it's pretty clear when he says, Daniel RPK, that like, "Oh, no, no, like, he's still gonna make appearances." Think that's a given because there's no
Yeah,
reason you don't take your most famous and popular characters of Disney Plus era and then make them into stars on the film stage, especially now with everyone realizing that the streaming bubble isn't infinite, right? It's not continuously expanding, it's not a big bang. There were limits to what we can do. Shows that we enjoy now, like Rings of Power, Wheel of Time, House of Dragon, all that, they feel that crunch, and the movies that have come out too, Marvel and all that, they feel the crunch, so it's kinda just like how it was in the '50s and '60s when it seemed like TV was about to take over and dominate again. No,
yeah,
like, at some point, there's gonna be regulations, sure, but there's also just gonna be the fact that movies, when you actually use the medium properly, are just so much more enriching, so much more capable, and they're gonna be something more widely seen and talked about and discussed than just another TV show, right? Obviously, we might come back in 20, 30 years and it'll be almost no difference between TV and movies by that point, but I think this clearly was a big first stab for everyone outside of Netflix of saying like, "Hey, we can continue our franchises across these 2 mediums, and our stories can just continue, and people bob back and forth." But that's just we're not trained for that yet, and a lot of kids these days don't even watch TV shows like that. They watch it on their phones, so there's definitely kids who might know everything about the Mandoverse, but they're like, "I don't know anything about the movies. I was too young for that and all that." There's still significant separation. So, if there is a continuation series of sorts, it almost feels like a bridge series to me because there is that rumor of like a trilogy of Mando films to like get us into place before the inevitable New Republic film that Dave Filoni is making. That's what Giancarlo was saying recently in an interview too. I could definitely see them transition Mando into just becoming a strong supporting player, and a lot of these movies maybe take the lead for half of a film, but now maybe start bringing in some of the big guns who, as much as people be like, "Oh, nostalgia," like, now we're not playing with the new characters that we have here. It makes sense for this era to bring in the original trilogy big hitters, right? Like a Lando, like a Han, a Luke, a Leia, so I wouldn't be surprised if they are trying to make some big, big splash here. They're trying to get some connectivity, obviously, with Mando and Grogu, and then we put it all together, maybe bring back Ahsoka and all that, you're building up Ezra. You're trying to bring, like, a huge, huge cast of, like, these incredible freedom fighters and Jedi and all that, and then make them almost equivalent to this huge armada that surely they're trying to build Thrawn up to, especially because our only appearance of live action for so many is about a man who is, while intelligent, definitely just running away using the very limited resources that he's had for something of a decade to just scramble out of an entire galaxy. So, no matter what, even if we are gonna be playing into that '90s Heir to the Empire saga feel, we have to build it up, and I don't think you can just say The Mandalorian is gonna carry us there. You have to bring him because he's too famous, but maybe the movies are the way that we actually continue the story. We make him just another part of the Mandoverse and turn this into maybe the heir to the Empire verse or the Thrawn verse by the end. Who knows? But I think this is the right choice, honestly. I think we're a little burnt out on a lot of Star Wars TV shows. They should be able to exist on their own and not just be filling in gaps. If they do, that should be secondary to telling a great story. And unfortunately, that's what the Acolyte kind of failed in doing. But I want to see swings like that and I want that to happen once we have a couple of safer hits on the big screen and TV again.
Yeah, I think movies, what these studios have realized over the years and what they continue to realize every time it feels like movies are going away is that you can't really replicate the event feeling that is a movie at home. There's just no way to replicate it. You can't really leg out the feeling of going to the movie theater and discussing it with people, being one of the first people to see it. You can't do that with a TV show at home that goes 8 weeks or 9 weeks or 10 weeks. It just doesn't have that same feel. Now there's fun conversation about it, but we're so inundated with content at home that a lot of the conversation comes and then the next day it's gone. And then you wait another week and it comes back and then it's gone again. And there's just not that same type of big, huge event style that we see with films in the theaters. And I think the studios have started to realize that once again. I mean, they knew that before the pandemic, but then the pandemic has kind of blinded the way people looked at it because they were making zeros in, in the movie theater at the time. Nothing was making money. So they look at their bottom line and they're like, wow, look at streaming's keeping us afloat. That's the future. And then when they start getting big hits again, they're like, wow, this one movie has made up for 6 months of our streaming revenue. Like, that's what they can do. And so I think you're gonna see the biggest properties return back to theaters again, or at least an attempt to return back to the theaters. I buy that there's no Mandalorian season 4 plans anytime soon. I completely buy that. I don't buy that The Mandalorian is disappearing as a marquee name for anything in the future. Like, if this report, maybe I'm misunderstanding what this person's saying, but if this report is saying there's not gonna be a Mandalorian and Grogu 2, I don't buy that whatsoever. If this movie makes money, there will be 10 more Mandalorian and Grogus. There's going to be an extra Mandalorian and Grogu that they're not planning to fit into a trilogy. There's going to be all of these Mandalorian and Grogu stuff because one of the keys and the secret sauces of the Mandalorian, and one of the reasons I do think he still is going to appear in a lot of cameos on TV, and there still is a chance that maybe 5 years down the road, hell, even maybe 2 years after Mandalorian and Grogu comes out, we get a Mandalorian season 4, is the fact that he is not played by a famous actor. Pedro Pascal comes in and voices him only now. He's voicing him for, like, a week, and then he's done. So they can shoot this movie without having to pay a really famous person to be on set for 6 months. They can shoot these things without having to really abide by the Hollywood code of we need superstar to sell product. Now, The Mandalorian and their little animatronic puppet Grogu sell this better than any actor really could. And so I think that's why this franchise in particular is probably going to be eternal, is because it's just something that they can bank on without having to put the resources or scheduling the right, the contracts of these actors. They can shoot around their whims instead of having to worry about other people for the bulk of the work. And so I think that's why this show is going to really last forever. But I agree with the report if it's saying that Mandalorian season 4 is the thing that's canceled because I think that is for now. I think it could come back, and I think it could come back as some type of rebooted show with a colon and then some other subtitle under The Mandalorian, a reboot of sorts, a follow-up show, a sequel show, and like I've said in the past, there's no way they're letting this universe kind of die, whether it's a Bo-Katan-led show, whether it's a Boba Fett-led show, whether it's a valuable enough IP to try to do like we just saw with the Acolyte and go back in time and tell stories about the Mandalorians during the time between the Old Republic and the High Republic, or during the High Republic, or before the prequels, or even during the prequels. We haven't really seen any Mandalorian stories until the Clone Wars. So, what are they doing during Phantom Menace? What are they doing in between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones? I think the Mandalorian as an IP is so rich and such an easy one to be able to label things Mandalorian and then go and show a show where you just have a bunch of people in cool armor doing things and people will go watch it because that's one of the things that makes the Mandalorians awesome. Now, it will lose a little bit of the heart and soul of the show is based around Grogu. So how do you fill that hole if they ever do that? I don't know, but I do think there's plenty more Mandalorian, and I think this first Mandalorian and Grogu film is the proving ground for this franchise being theatrical And if it flops, we are getting a Mandalorian season 4 because there's no way they ditch a popular TV IP if it doesn't do well in theaters. Then it's basically confirmation that yeah, okay, it's not a theatrical franchise, but this is a strong television franchise, and we're going to keep going with this on TV. So I could see this being the start, and yeah, like you said, we have comments here about people talking about this could be a trilogy of movies. And I wouldn't be surprised if Mandalorian and Grogu is the first movie of a trilogy, and then the second movie has something to do with Ahsoka, and then the third movie you finally get your Heir to the Empire movie. And it's built up in a way to where Mandalorian's not always the name on the movie or not always the main face of the movie, but he's going to be in every single one of these movies in some capacity. So, yeah, and that's where I think this rumor, some people have taken it and run with like, "Oh, Mandalorian's done. There's no more Mandalorian," and there's no way that's happening. He is the face of Star Wars right now, for better or worse. The Mandalorian and Grogu are the face of Star Wars, and there's no way that they don't run with that for at least a little bit longer. And I think they'll probably run with it forever because he's a faceless character for the most part, especially now with no Pedro Pascal in season 3. So, what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments. We'll get to some of your comments right now. Skywalker's Academy says, hello there, Liam and Sanak. Hello there, Skywalker's Academy. Also says, Giancarlo Esposito, speaking during a panel at Dragon Con, hints that the movie might be the first in a trilogy. One article says he was told Jon Favreau has plans for a trilogy. John has wanted to make shows for Boba Fett all along. He's probably written many stories that can be adapted for Mandalorians. And I think that's definitely a good point. Trilogies are part of the DNA of Star Wars, and I don't mind that formula coming back where as long as they're planned, and that's what scares me a little bit about Mandalorian and Grogu is yeah, you can want to do a trilogy, but if there's not really an overarching plan when they made this one, I don't know if it's worth legging it out for a trilogy. Come up with the second story first instead of saying let's come up with two more stories. Come up with the second story first, come up with the entire arc and feel out whether you think that could be a strong way to connect. But the thing I do have is a lot of faith in Jon Favreau because the guy has lived and breathed movies and franchise movies his entire life. TV was the thing he was new to. And so if he's got a plan, if he's got an arc, I think he could make a good trilogy of movies. And like you said, I mean Mandalorian has been a Boba Fett show basically with the addition of Grogu, right? It was supposed to be a Boba Fett show. They decided not to go with Boba Fett at the first. They brought him into the show. The Boba Fett show didn't work as well. Now take that same episodic format, apply it to Boba Fett, use the bounty hunting elements. I think we could get really the best of both worlds with Boba Fett in an 8-episode weekly show, doing a bunch of bounties, and really stepping away from the version of him we saw in Book of Boba Fett.
Yeah, I'm of the same thought. I mean, yes, Filoni, as wonderful as he is, right? He's not some cinematic genius in the way that Favreau is. Like, I don't think if you put Filoni in the same situation with today's experience, right, with the sets that he's been on, and the directors he's shadowed and everything, and tell him, hey, here's a box of scraps, right? And let's make Iron Man, right? Literally just like the whole meme with Obadiah Stane. No, right? Like there's no way. Like with that, I know you have to give a lot of credit to Robert Downey Jr. and incredible cast and crew, obviously, but you still need a director putting their heart and soul in making what is now still the centerpiece of the biggest franchise ever, right? So, yeah, I think this guy, when it comes to filmmaking, he's always been pushing the right buttons. He's always pushing the cutting edge. He did the same thing with The Mandalorian. And when you kept the stories pretty basic, yeah, he did great. It's when you were asking him to start doing a lot of the interconnectivity stuff and then tie in with shows without the lore and the richness that Star Wars kind of bleeds off of every single episode and movie that it has, even the bad ones, right? Like there's inevitably you'll see something in the background or some interesting subtext put in play, and that's where it became harder, right? Again, like we started with this episode here, it was a bad move for whatever they were trying to do with Book of Boba Fett in general. You took away from the character of Boba Fett instead of committing to this full bit here. You end his show with him missing 2 of his episodes because you're like, people will forget about the Mandalorian after 1 year, despite that being one of the best choices on TV in years. Honestly, like that that is something that plays with your expectations. Like, how long? How long until we get to see them again? And yeah, you waste an entire episode on building an N1 ship, which is not seemingly going to be a feature as featured in The Mandalorian and Grogu now, since there is a new Razor Crest. Okay, so that becomes a waste of an episode, despite all the stuff happening on the Halo Ring station. That I liked all that stuff. You miss out on Boba in that whole episode. And then that next episode, yeah, it's awesome seeing Luke and all this and that, but there's the questions of deep faking. Is that really a viable thing for that character moving forward and all of that? Is this something that Din Djarin really needs to be around for? Can we have just seen this lesson and then almost have Grogu feel his like father figure show up and then be like, no, I can't. Like, I need to keep my distance and then be swayed to do it on his own, right? Like, we kind of get that. I'm not denying that. But then we can see Boba for 5 seconds giving a nice little head nod to Din Djarin, and it takes over the show. And I like the finale still, as messy as it is. But can you imagine 2 more episodes of really fleshing out who Boba is, his reasons for this, the crew that he's putting together, more time with the kids and trying to make them more less of like a funny, goofy Vespa squad, but more outcasts that are trying to go against the grain of typical Tatooine culture and be their own person, and that's the respect that maybe Boba finds in them and they find in him too. It was old there. That's the saddest thing. I think even though he's not a great TV show maker, Favreau still had the pieces of making something really interconnected and still well told. But he misstepped there and it hurt the moneymaker, which is The Mandalorian. So I think moving it to the movies for season 4, supposedly being abbreviated into this Mandalorian Grogu film, I think is perfect because there's been very few films from Favreau that I've been like, no. He always has an energy to them. He always has a great sense of grandness and scale. He always knows to push the buttons a little further with the tech, and I think that he brings out a lot of great acting and characterization when he doesn't have to deal with scripts that are stretched out and 8 hours worth of storytelling instead of like a nice compact 2. That's always where he's thrived. So yeah, I expect to see a little bit more of even like that original version of the Mandalorian, the gunslinger that he had.
Yeah.
I'm sure now he's a little bit more tied into the lore. I'm sure Disney and Lucasfilm Story Group are like, people keep on asking, is this all happening in 9 APY? And you can't keep on telling them that because it makes zero sense for anybody.
Yeah.
And I'm sure those things have to be considered now, right? Once you brought back Iger, once all the big IPs are kind of in flux now, you got to be on your A game. So I'm sure that little balance and push and pull that he and Filoni had that worked. Now that Filoni's kind of going in his own lane and is now kind of the head of Disney Plus Star Wars for the Mandoverse era, you got to have Favreau pull his weight. You maybe bring Filoni to make sure to boost up some of the dialogue. Okay, maybe not dialogue, but story. And you have to do
The
these things.
lore.
And I'm sure eventually we will get Boba back in some form. I would kind of love it if they continue going into the whole Mandalorian background that he has, obviously being someone who is almost excommunicated according to the Clone Wars, is not considered a Mandalorian, but he is technically Mandalorian by the armor, by his father also being a youngling of sorts, right? There's going to be a lot you can do with Boba and his own Mandalorian heritage too, while still allowing him to go darker, kind of go back to that original version that we all really still like and never got to see outside of video games and books and kind of wanted to see in live action. And we got quite a bit in Mando season 2. Double down on that and still work with the parts that are there. There's nothing inherently broken in Star Wars to me. You can take anything. It might not work the first time, but if you can segue it, spin it off, connect it, tie it together in a different way, you can get some incredible things. The idea that you can't say Star Wars can fix itself is silly to me because Star Wars in of itself is like a remix generator. You take all these different genres, characters, storylines from all throughout human history, some in original ideas as well, put it together, and you get to create these wonderful, fascinating stories that are universally appealing. Sometimes Star Wars does just become too much self-referential, but I think it's very useful to be self-referential when you're trying to fix the things that don't necessarily work together or but their heads a little bit more. So I'm sure and I pray that they definitely spend a little bit more time just like saying, okay, we did well the first 2 seasons when we were together. what did we miss here? Why didn't Boba Fett really get off the mark like that? Why is Mando season 3 considered a bit middle water for a lot of people? I'm sure that just looking at the pieces missing, what they left on the cutting floor, then the shift to back to movies will make sure things are smarter, cut to the bone properly when needed, but allow it to actually breathe and live when necessary.
Yeah, no, I think those are all good points, and Boba Fett as a character just I think he deserves that type of show. He deserves a revamp, he deserves an upgrade, and he deserves what could have been Mandalorian season 4. We were going back in that direction. I think it's the direction, I mean, from all things we've seen and heard, it's the direction Favreau always wanted to go, and then Filoni had all this other lore to interject, and that's where they went with season 2 and season 3, and it was getting back to the Favreau version. And that's why I think it is the perfect place in that story to go back to a movie format because there's a break in it. Like we did have 3 complete seasons for better or worse of that show, and so I think Boba stepping in, you can honestly just call it The Mandalorian: Boba Fett. That
Yeah,
works. You don't have to do
yeah,
Book of Boba Fett. That is kind of a tarnished name, and honestly, it is kind of a weird name already for a TV show. Um, but yeah, just call it The Mandalorian Boba Fett or Boba Fett: A Mandalorian Story, Boba
yeah.
Fett: A
I
Mandalorian
think that
Tale, something like that, and you could do it, and I think it would work quite well. And just keep taking this character further and further. I mean, you have an actor who's rarely do you have an actor who's very willing to be a part of these things like Tamora Morrison, who is not somebody who he's not a nobody. It's not like he's desperate for work. He's a popular actor and he does great work and he's older and he's probably enjoying having a semi-retirement of sorts as he gets older, and he's willing to come back and play Boba Fett as much as people want him to. And I think when you have those opportunities, it really is you're really going to regret it down the line if you don't take them, because where are we right now with the original trilogy actors, right? We're in a point where we're like, do we recast? Do you do de-aging? What do you do with these characters? You can't decide in 15 years you want to do more Boba Fett and skip your opportunity right now to do more Boba Fett. You have the opportunity presented to you. And I feel the same way about, Ewan McGregor and Obi-Wan Kenobi. I don't think there really needs to be a season 2 of Obi-Wan Kenobi, but if Ewan McGregor wants to do it, might as well. He's here, he's around, he's the right age, and he can do it right now, and he wants to do it. You might as well take these opportunities because in a universe like Star Wars, where it's so interconnected and where the fan base has such a hard time accepting new people as new characters, you should take opportunities the way they come and take advantage of these shows. As Anthony Tiff says, I agree. The movie will probably be the first of a trilogy. Then says, I don't think the rumors are accurate because it does not make sense for Din and Grogu to sit out Thrawn conflict. And I agree with that just because they are the face of this entire franchise. I don't think they necessarily have any real stakes in the specific Thrawn conflict. Like, I don't think they have to be there. They're not New Republic. They've helped New Republic. They're not New Republic. So I don't think they have any stakes in the conflict, but they're the face of this whole franchise. The whole Thrawn thing has started through their eyes. They
yeah.
should be there and be a part of this show.
Yeah, I fully agree. I want them here in the story. You don't even have to have them be these big players to start off. You can use the Mandalorian and be like, you thought the world was big with him and what he walked into. All right, now watch as he feels like a small fry, right? Even though he's got this pupil who was under Luke for a while. Like, let's see what's really happening in this burgeoning new republic, the struggles against the Imperial Remnant, what it represents, right? And yes, I know canon to some degree cannot ever go to the fullest extent that EU had with the Imperial Remnants, but I'd argue you could just make Thrawn's the only major EU remnant that matters, and whatever else
Yeah.
is, kind of playing around in the galaxy, they can stay small, they can be warlords, and if they survive, it's because they're pulled out into the First Order's burgeoning, colonization and placement in the unknown regions, right? So, I'm, as much as I love a lot of the early '90s EU, there are some things that just you're like, "Okay, I guess they took over this part. Oh, I guess another one formed here." It's like, "Okay, I guess they were all everywhere." that makes sense in some ways, but sometimes the way they expanded, I never really enjoyed it or understood it. Like, one of my favorites is the Pentastar Alliance, but there isn't really a story for how they became so powerful and valuable. You kinda have to read The Essential Guide to Warfare to understand how Thrawn was limited in some ways, how they set up things for the Dark Empire, and you're like, "Okay, that would have been useful information for these 2 stories that are only a year apart." So, whatever they do here with Imperial Remnant, I think more in some ways is more important than having these original trilogy heroes, because I just wanna make sure that if this conflict comes, it is notable, it is big, but it's not necessarily just another thing, and, okay, we'll get another one 3, 4 years, okay. That's kinda how the EU kind of drags for that whole Bantam era, because they just spend 10 years keeping Mara and Luke apart, just going through all these crazy little conflicts. Luke falls in love with someone every other day. Leia and Han have kids that keep on getting kidnapped, right? Like, you're gonna have to condense it, and I think in some ways, even now with some of the struggles that has been there with The Mandalorian and that whole Mandoverse kind of having shaken ground, the fact that we've really haven't explored a lot of the pre-sequel trilogy stuff that should be fulfilling and making a lot of the gaps a little bit clearer. Even then, I still think that we're in a decent position because Thrawn is now back in the galaxy, and you can do a lot with the character of Lars Mikkelsen's caliber and just the potential now to really source from the best parts of the EU with like the X-Wing books and the visuals of Dark Empire that haven't already been used with obviously the Thrawn trilogy, the source books, everything like that, and still put in a bunch of fun new stuff that has been developed Disney canon and has been continued since the Clone Wars. So, yeah, I mean, can you imagine saying to somebody like, "Yeah, we're gonna get a Heir to the Empire adaptation. Maybe there wasn't as much Luke and Leia as you wanted, but hey, did you know Captain Rex was in this?" Like, it's such a great thing that this could still be, even with some of the struggles, a nice, like, melting pot of pre-sequel stuff, stuff that's definitely just right after the original trilogy, and, the final, like, hurrahs of the prequel trilogy characters and storylines. I think that's what Heir to the Empire, especially Dark Force Rising, is always trying to pull from, the pre-Empire era, the Clone Wars. It is the backbone of so many MacGuffins and everything in the story, and now we live in an era that we have 3 defined trilogies, and you can really work with all those elements and enrich the story as best as you can. Even if it never reaches the literary heights, I still think you can get a lot of incredible storylines, use the characters that we love, characters that we've grown to love in the last 10 years or so, and make something that is at least a worthy, like, parallel to it.
Anthony says, I recently rewatched Revenge of the Sith, and man, it was great to watch my favorite Star Wars movie after 3 years. That is a long time in between watching Revenge of the Sith, Anthony, but I'm glad you enjoyed watching it again. I have a hard time going more than like 6 to 8 months without watching Revenge of the Sith. Anthony also says, I bought the Rise of Skywalker novelization, probably the best novelization ever released. That is a bold claim unless you made a typo and meant to type in Revenge of the Sith. But I'm glad you like the Rise of Skywalker novelization. It does actually enhance the movie in quite a few ways. I don't think it goes far enough. It is still a relatively short novelization, but there are some moments where things aren't said on screen that it does add to. Like I think it adds to the Rey and Kylo Ren death and then transfer of life and then death again. I think it adds to that moment. And it also did give us a little bit of backstory on Palpatine that the movie didn't give us at the time. So it was kind of our only source of information about why is Palpatine back. That answer is not really in the book, but it is there. But yeah, I'd have to go with Revenge of the Sith. That's the best novelization still. But I'm glad you enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I hope we can one day do the novelization from Matthew Stover for Revenge of the Sith. It'd be a fun way to like re-experience these films without necessarily watching them. Trying to take the best adult novelization that is there of all of them, right? Can you imagine going from Matthew Stover's and then continuing on to Alan Dean Foster's original novelization, Ghost, written by George Lucas? Like, it would be such an interesting way to just look at the trilogies put together. And maybe that if you guys want something like that, we can definitely do that. We are definitely ramping up the book reviews on our channel again. We've got stuff for the High Republic coming out. We just got Glass Abyss, so we're trying to get that one out quickly. Got a Padawan's Pride audible audiobook review. Like, X-Wing, first 4, like, we have a lot coming out, so if you guys want something like that, that is, like, an interesting way of, like, still being movie adjacent, we could definitely do that as well.
And Anthony did mean Revenge of the Sith. That's an acronym that I mess up too sometimes,
Yeah.
so, no worries there, but yeah, it is such a great novelization. It's absolutely incredible. I think all the prequel novelizations are really, really good. The original trilogy ones are fun to read because they're so different, because a lot of them are based on the script of the original trilogy movies, and then those changed a lot in the edit, like, and one thing George Lucas has always admitted about his own style is that he's somebody who just kinda shoots things, and then he loves to fix his movies in the edit. Like, that's his favorite one of his favorite parts of filmmaking is editing, and, he loves to make a lot of changes in the edit to his movies, and,
Even
you see
after
it when you
he
read the
releases his movies.
yeah, exactly, and after, and then the next release, and then the next release.
Yeah.
Uh, but, you see it when you read those original novelizations of especially the original Star Wars movie, but, all 3 of them feature a lot of things that are not in the movies and not and then eventually, not even in the lore altogether. So those ones are fun, but I do think the overall quality of the prequel novelizations are really good. I mean, you have Terry Brooks writing The Phantom Menace, like that that's kind of a crazy get for a Star Wars novelization. Moving on to where were we scrolling up? Up, up, up. Okay, Critical Thinker says, I wouldn't put any stock in what Giancarlo said, as nothing he said sounds definitive. He just said that his this was his sense of where it was all going. And I think that's fair too. I mean, Giancarlo Esposito is one of those actors who loves to talk, and
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
time he gets interviewed, he'll say something and then people run with it. So I agree that you can't really put too much stock in some of the things he says because gets very excited about his roles, and especially when he has roles in like big franchises, which he has been getting more, and he's been trying to tiptoe around talking about his Marvel roles. He's revealed stuff about his Star Wars roles in the past. So yeah, I don't know if you can take everything he says too literally, but he sometimes he hasn't really like spoiled anything yet, but I feel like if they ever give him a big plot point, he is gonna be a Tom Holland or one of those actors, a Mark Ruffalo, who just has a very hard time containing some of the things he knows about different projects.
Yeah, he's a character, I think when people look at him, right, they think Gus from Breaking Bad, but,
Yeah,
he's so famous for a lot of great TV and films, and, oh, man, like, what I'm bug is
do the
it
right thing.
Bug yeah, Do the
Yeah,
Right Thing, but what's the character's name? Bugging
bug
Out
out,
or
right? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, bugging out, right? That's his character, the guy who gets his sneakers run over by a Celtics fan, and yeah, he's just hilarious. He's, like, so exaggerated, and he obviously, he does have a lot of exaggeration in a lot of his roles outside of Breaking Bad, and I think people are noticing that more, especially since he's played a lot of, like, the more humorous villain roles recently. But yeah, I mean, this is a guy who started off with like a lot of comedic chops, and I think that really suits his personality. It's like an extension of who he is. And even though he's gone much older, he still is kind of that same guy like he is when he's playing Bugging Out. He's wild, he's loud, and you're like, what are you saying sometimes? And
Yeah.
that's the great thing about actors, right? Like there's so much that you can take at face value, and other times you're like, I don't know about that, right? It's always fun to discuss, but yeah, he's he can be a lot, and I think this is probably one of the situations maybe there is a few kernels of truth because someone like Daniel RPK who hasn't been totally inconsistent with his like rumors and leaks, but has had a decent long enough record could pull something like this out. I don't know how accurate he is. I think everyone is a little wrong here, and I don't think
Mhm.
you should base it off of Giancarlo if that is the original source because he is quite a troll.
Yeah, he's not really anything like Moff Gideon or Gus in real life. You just watch any interview and he's has not no personality similar to those characters at all, which makes his performance even better. Uh, Skywalker's Academy says exactly, but it's definitely there are no there's it's definite there are no more seasons of The Mandalorian. I don't think that's 100% for sure, Skywalker's Academy, but it is sounding like The Mandalorian is on hold for sure right now. Um, Anthony says, a word of advice: never post your Star Wars tier list on Reddit. Yeah, I mean, you are asking for everybody to comment on it. So, um,
That's why we
I
put
won't
ours
do
on
that.
YouTube.
Yep, that's why we put ours on YouTube and wait for the comments. And there was another one coming out. We have a new topic coming out. It'll be out tomorrow, actually, and it's a Star Wars versus Lord of the Rings rankings that we did kind of in honor of Rings of Power wrapping up, and we're planning on doing more tier lists like that where we take other franchises and do a comparison with Star Wars because it allows us to talk about some other things that aren't just Star Wars on the channel, and it also gives us, more variety of tier lists that we can do. So hopefully you guys enjoy that and look forward to the future one. And I know the one that a lot of people really want us to do is MCU, and we will, but we're going to try to time these with big releases. So I guess the next big MCU release would be Captain America, so it might not happen until then. Maybe we'll do like a Spider-Verse one or something for Venom. I don't know. Let us know if some of the ones you guys want to see if you like that idea. Okay, moving on. We have Critical Thinker says, if you were put in charge of Star Wars, what shows, books, and movies would you pitch? We've gotten this question a few times, and this is always a tough one. I feel like it changes all the time based on the trajectory that the franchise is going. So I always say there are a couple different ways I can answer this question. One is with the realistic answer of what could they actually do right now that I would pitch that I would want them to make that would it would go with what's the word I want to use? Um, it's just it would go with everything they're working on right now and make sense for the trajectory they have with Star Wars. It would make sense for the world they're trying to build out, which is definitely so much so a part of the New Republic right now. And so as for show, I think the absolute must right now, and it goes with my comment earlier about Tamara Morrison and Obi-Wan, or Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan and Tamara Morrison as Boba Fett. I really think you need to capitalize on the fact that Mark Hamill is still around and still active and still capable of making a Luke Skywalker show. And I think it makes it assuages a lot of the complaints that people have about the sequels, where you never get to see Jedi Master Luke. You'd get to see full Jedi Master Luke in that show. It would be a show about the downfall of Luke's Jedi Academy, where you can have a couple seasons where you start to see the downfall creeping up. You get maybe a young Ben Solo. I think it's all right to recast, even though there's only 4 years between Ben's fall and the rise of Kylo Ren and The Force Awakens. I think it would be okay to recast a younger Ben, but if Adam Driver wants to come back, great. And you tell that story about the fall of Ben Solo. You tell the story about the fall of Luke's Academy, but you start with it at its kind of its peak. And we see some fun adventures with Luke and Ben. We see the different people who populate Luke's Jedi Academy. And of course, we see Mara Jade and we see all the characters that help create Luke and make him the Jedi Master who he is and why he falls so hard when all this falls apart. I think that's a story that has to be told at some point, and you might as well take the opportunity to do it with Mark Hamill, who is still alive and still around and in a good physical health enough to where he could play Luke Skywalker. And I think you could not have to do too much de-aging to him to make him look like the Luke Skywalker that's in the Last Jedi hologram scene, the Luke Skywalker that's in the flashbacks that you see in the Last Jedi and Force Awakens, the Luke Skywalker that's on the cover of Shadow of the Sith. I think you can make him look like that, and it wouldn't take too much de-aging or too much makeup or prosthetics. So that would be the number one thing in terms of realistic projects that they could actually do soon that I think they should certainly take advantage of and just do. Let's just get it out of the way and let's give people a reason to start being interested in the sequels again, because we're getting so far away from the sequels. You got this Rey movie coming out. Give people a reason to kind of try to fall back in love with that version of the original trilogy characters before we move on from them completely. So that's where I would go for sure with a current realistic project. Another semi-realistic project that I've talked about in the past is I want Darth Plagueis done. As you guys know, I really don't like the Acolyte, and I'm kind of glad that Darth Plagueis is not going to be associated with the Acolyte style of storytelling for his overall narrative. But I think you could do, like I said in that video I made a while ago, you could do a Darth Plagueis show or film series where you wrap up the final loose ends of the Khmer and Osha story as kind of a distant plot point, one that's from the perspective of Plagueis rather than from their perspective. Then you move on to Palpatine. Then you tell the Palpatine story. And then you move on with Palpatine being the main character and you tell the end of the Plagueis story. I think those are the two right now that I would want most, that I think are realistic with things they've actually done, and that I would really like to see them actually do. Now, the other thing I'll just throw out is what I also made a video about. I'm not opposed to them doing another timeline or recasting. I think telling stories in the spirit of the original trilogy, in the original spirit of the EU, creating a timeline or a universe that is cohesive, and you just start from the beginning and you go to the end, give people jump on you when you say MCU-esque, but like MCU-esque in the way it's structured, not necessarily in that you need 50 different movies with different franchise and all the different heroes. It needs I think MCU-esque in the world building and the way you structure it up into a big event movies, big stories. I would like to see Star Wars become that type of big event again. I mean, we're getting our feet wet right now with Mandalorian and Grogu, and we'll see what they go for in the future of films. But I'd like to see Star Wars become a big event again. And I think the heart and soul of Star Wars has always lied with the good versus evil conflict that's in the original trilogy. And I think that's one of the reasons why the EU works so well. So I wouldn't mind seeing that as like a very unlikely, distant possible pitch for a movie series. So yeah, those would be my choices.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I would also say I wanna see Luke's academy. There's just so many characters that have been dropped in the most recent comics and everything. While they've been so very scarce about who else is in the academy, really, it is just we know Laura Santeca helps and, is more about, like, the explorative reclamation side of the Force, without being a Force user himself, and then the Padawans that we see alongside Ben and the rise of Kylo Ren. But other than that, we don't know anything, right? So I would love to see an animated series. I think that's where Mark Hamill would be able to, like, fully be able to go crazy with it. I'd almost wanna do it inverted where the main story is told in the animated series, but maybe some of the more bigger scenes are, like, small shorts, kinda like how, like, when Blade Runner 2049 came out, they had, like, an animated short, and then they had a couple live action ones. I'd want, like, live action shorts for stuff that if we don't get, like, a TV show or a movie for, like, the Luke and the Snoke fight that's implied to happen, just make it into one of those shorts where you
Mm.
can still build around it. You can still like connect the TV shows or some other spin-off, and then you have that as a story. If you don't really want to spend so much of a budget leading into that, maybe you just like, I want to spend 30 minutes here just going over the fight and some of the causes and the fallout. I like something like that, but I do think animation is probably the best way for Luke's story, just because I do think where his academy probably thrives in my mind is probably how he ensures that the Jedi legacy and from the past for the prequels, from what he recovered from the High Republic and even before that, is at least preserved and kept hidden and secret in stashes, right? I don't think it's going to be completely eradicated and destroyed in the same way as the First Order does with Ben Solo's conversion, in the same way that Palpatine did with Anakin and then the Inquisitorius and all that. I think that's where Luke's academy will thrive because he'll be able to be almost like a virtual teacher of sorts because he's kept away these things in stashes. He's made plenty of holocrons. He's recovered plenty, and just like made sure that even if I don't succeed in the off chance, which he might have always thought about because of the vision that he believes in, that his sister believes in about Ben within 1 year of her training. He starts, kind of planting these things and these seeds. And I'd like to see that because then you could start exploring more planets with really diverse biomes and all that. That's still something that I feel like a lot of the Mandoverse shows kind of lack. They don't really get to go as rich and mixed with like I still don't think we really see like outside of Andor like a beach next to like a nice tropical forest with some deserts like in the hidden distance with mountains and all that. I don't think I've really seen anything quite like that in live action. So as much as I want to, I just don't see, Disney at this point really feeling the need to go, "Hey, we're gonna go HBO-esque quality and money and time on a Luke Skywalker story," because Hamill is older, and even if we wanted to do the prime teacher Luke that still has the incredible battles, prowess, and all that, there's only so much you can do without having to rely heavily on stunt doubles and all that, and then the question is, well, isn't that better as a movie or something? So, and I think that takes away from the Academy sense that I really wanna explore, and the nuances of, hey, maybe there are more philosophical differences between the Jedi that remain after this whole Mandoverse conflict. Like, if an Ahsoka is gone and it's just an Ezra, like, how similar are they really, right? They're both kinda trained with similar mentors, they still have connections to Yoda and stuff like that, but are they gonna really be the same? If Ahsoka's around, is she gonna be like a different breakaway of like, "Hey, we're just gonna be Jedi influenced, but not Jedi?" If a Cal Kestis makes an appearance like we are talking about last week, what is his role? Is he like, "Nope, I have my own successful planet that is hidden away, protected. I'm not gonna connect other than, like, the occasional, like, academy visits and exchange programs or something." Like, there's gonna be so much nuance, I think, that can come out of at least the first 10 years of Luke's Academy when he should theoretically be bringing everyone together. But just like the Jedi Academy trilogy and the comics and games surrounding it, the students fall to darkness or they die and, or just leave the academy even. So I think you can take some of the best elements of those EU stories and take something really rich if you get to use animation as the medium. So that's what I would push for as my biggest one. With the High Republic Phase 3 kind of ending, I do think that it'd be really nice if we get to see some stuff that is set just before phase 2 so that it has, like, something to pair with. I don't really see much of an insane need to connect phase 2 to phase 3 outside of or phase 1, I guess, outside of some of the stuff that I've heard is happening with Tears of the Nameless and all that. I'd like it to be a great way to transition us from when we know about Bane being destroyed 1,000 years before. I'd like to see that destruction and then the Dark Ages that take place before the High Republic, the renaissance of the galaxy really begins again. Because I think that's a great way to kind of build off the ideas that Knight Errant and some stories like that came out in late EU really wanted to, but there really wasn't much time or space to really consider what does it look like if the galaxy is, like, totally hemorrhaged and damaged? The Force, with technology, with civilization, with governments. How do we rise above that, right? And I think the High Republic as its position right now is very much a reclamation, a renaissance, and that doesn't come without the Dark Ages, and I think that's a great way to, like, still tell your own original story that hasn't really been touched by the EU and still give us plenty of time to really work on a very definitive HBO caliber Tales of the Jedi all the way up to Bane's destruction. I think I'd love to see something like that happen, obviously, but I want Disney to mature. Right now, Disney Plus, some of the smartest choices it's made since Mando season 2 has been kind of just getting Hulu involved, right? For a bit more of a mature audience coming to their platform. Otherwise, they've been very IP driven and like just banking on that and the tone set by the movies and all that. When they have the opportunity to go darker, to go more mysterious, to go more heavy, and they should with the Old Republic regardless. So I don't think they're ready with what they've shown us so far with the Mandoverse. The only thing they've had close to that is Andor, obviously, which is fantastic. But is that something sustainable over like 4 or 5 seasons, over hundreds of years of storytelling and all that? I don't think Disney's quite there. So I think working with post all that stuff happening in that gap era where it is still pretty untouched, I think that's where I'd like to go next. And obviously, as always, I just wanna see something Clone Wars equivalent with the sequels, stuff that's set just before, during the one-year gap, even during the films, and after. Just build out that stuff, be a nice bridge, introduce characters that can be part of that new Jedi Order race, Jedi Order era, supplement the film in the best way, and ideally, I would love to have this Luke animated show kinda happening at the same time as the new Jedi Order film, especially if they cross-cut with each other and really build off of each other, but I can also definitely see people in the fandom being like, "Oh, I'm not gonna watch the movie, like, this is, like, the real story that matters here and all that," but it also doesn't matter. It's like, "Okay, fine. If you're gonna be upset by both, then there's no point." But I do truly think if you put Ray's Order films and live action media with the Luke Skywalker animated heavy medium, you only elevate both and you bring both people to Disney Plus after you finish watching the film in theaters. You're like, hey man, I want to see that thing that I heard was going to be referenced in this episode, the same way Mandalorian season one had Force Heal, and then we got to see it in episode 9, right? So stuff like that. That's kind of what I'd look for.
Great question. Thank you. We always appreciate those ones where we get to kind of spitball and talk about different random topics. So we really appreciate that. Thank you for sending that question in. And moving on to Dan the Man. Dan the Man says, "Fam, we're really getting a new Star Wars trilogy? Question mark. Not talking about the Mando mess, but the real deal. Holy Phil." uh, I'm not sure what you're talking about if you're not talking about the Mando stuff. I haven't heard anything about a new Star Wars trilogy. I mean, of course, the trilogy format was one that Star Wars basically popularized. It's not the first to do it, but they popularized doing stories and trilogies. So I think when you look at Rey's movie, there is always the possibility it's the start of a trilogy. There is always the possibility, and I'm still not counting out they don't call it episode 10 off the bat, but there's still a possibility that it's episode 10 post it coming out in the vein of the original trilogy, where like a couple years later you're like, you know what, we want to tell some more stories. This one's episode 10 now, and now we're doing 11. I think that would very much so upset people, but they could do that. But yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about if you're not talking about the Mando stuff, because I think that's the only rumor around right now. But if you want to clarify it in the comments, we'll come back to you there. Moving on to Anthony, who says, "One thing I do hate is when people get mad at you for liking both Legends and canon." Yeah, but that's why you stick around Star Wars, lads, because we appreciate and enjoy both. Skywalker's Academy says, "It's probably taking more time than I would, but I would start with hammering the sequel trilogy into shape. I'd throw some hints into something like The Mandalorian as to what's happening with Luke, etc." Yeah, I think that's a big one for me, and I meant to say that. I say that every time with books. If we don't recast, I very much so want to see the story of the OT characters fully told in the beginning of the New Republic era, especially during the Thrawn conflict. So if you're not going to recast, I don't think deepfake is good enough to tell their full stories. They can appear in moments. I'm fine with them appearing deepfake versions in scenes. I'm fine with them appearing in deep fake moments in fights and battles and duels, whatever. But I don't think you can tell a truly great story with them as deep fake characters in the Thrawn conflict. So if that's where their story is going to have to be told, you're going to have to do it in books if you don't do it in animation or you don't do it in recast. So yeah, I'm with you there, Skywalker's Academy. I want to see that. And then Skywalker's Academy also says if you separate them, oh, wait, okay, that's a different comment. So, yeah, moving on to your next comment. Well, if you separate them, Anthony, we love them both. If you try to mix the EU into canon, it fails horribly. And I think that is an interesting point, and that's kind of where my whole idea about just having a separate timeline for the legend stuff comes from. Is when you invite the EU material into canon, you are inviting comparison. That is kind of exactly what you're doing. So people are going to compare Thrawn from the EU to Thrawn in canon. People are going to compare Mara Jade in EU to Mara Jade in canon. It's always going to be open for comparison. And I think Star Wars initially, the idea of canon was to avoid those comparisons by not really bringing any EU stuff in. But then they slowly started bringing more EU stuff in. And while I enjoy and appreciate that because it means we could get more stories with those characters, it hasn't necessarily worked all the way around, or it's not at least been better than what we had in a lot of cases. And so that's where my idea really stemmed from, of just saying, let's just do two timelines, because then you don't have to adapt. Then you can just tell those stories. Yeah, they might not be as good as the books, but oftentimes movie adaptations aren't as good as the books. So you'd be accepting it as like an adaptation of Lord of the Rings, an adaptation of Harry Potter, an adaptation of any book to movie, where you're going to have to lose things, but you're getting the story that was there. And I think that's ultimately what canon needs to decide, is how much EU stuff do we want to bring in? Do we want to make this just a more cohesive version of the EU, where we bring in all the EU stuff, but we have a plan and we set it and we bring it in a way that works and makes sense without just it being a wink and a nod to the EU. Because right now they really aren't sure on whether they want a character to come in who's as important to canon as Thrawn is, or if they want to bring in a character just for a name drop to make fans excited. Because Star Wars doesn't really work like Marvel or DC, where you can just name drop somebody and people go, "Oh, I know who that is," because Star Wars has always been one single continuity, whether it was Legends or canon, books, comics, video games impacted the movies or the shows or vice versa. That's what it was always supposed to happen. And obviously, George Lucas didn't follow that. But that's always what the continuity has been of Star Wars. And I think that's why people get more angry when you do a name drop without actually giving any character to a character from EU versus in Marvel or DC movies, you get a name drop and people are like, that's cool. That's a little Easter egg because you don't necessarily need that character to do anything because it doesn't contribute to the overall comic story. But in the movie, it will now affect what they do in the comics and books. So I understand both sides of it. I love both sides of it. I want to keep improving canon because it's what we're stuck with. But I also do love Legends. So as you've heard a million times on this channel, and Sanak and I are both aligned on this point, there's no changing what we have. We have Star Wars canon. That is the reality that we live in. It's one we have to live with. So the only point in it is making it better. And I think it's completely fair to criticize things that are in Star Wars because that's the only way we can get better is if you point out criticism and try to help improve. But we can't say that they're just going to wipe this continuity out and go with a different one because that's not realistic. So the only way we get a different continuity is if they do two timelines. They're not going to erase the one that they've invested billions of dollars in already. And so that's really how I feel about that. But I'm glad you enjoy both because we do our best to enjoy both as well.
Yeah, can't say anything better than that.
Anthony says, I officially left 3 Star Wars subreddits today because they've gotten so toxic. A month ago, I considered them pretty friendly. Yeah, I'm not really on Reddit at all, but I would assume they do get pretty toxic. Dan the Man says, please see Star Wars, What If series, especially if What If Legends and Canon Merge episode. We'll have to check those out. Critical Thinker says, favorite Legends only primary character besides Thrawn, Mara Jade, and Revan. Well, you did take out the 3 best ones. For me, well, if you're taking out those ones, I guess never mind. I was going to say Bane, but Bane is technically canon too, even though he has no story in canon. So I feel like with a qualifier, I could say Bane and Plagueis. Are we also taking out like any of the Sith Legion stuff? So we're going to lose Nihilus, we're going to lose Malik, we're going to lose all the Sith because the Sith to me are the are the coolest. But if we're going New Republic, Jason Solo is one of my favorites. Also, Jaina Solo. I love both of them. All 3 of them. Anakin's great too. But Talon Card is one of my favorites. He's always stuck with me. And I do love Pelion. I really love Pelion. He's one of my favorite Imperials, if not my favorite Imperial officer ever. I think his journey from who could have been just a forgettable Thrawn sidekick in the Thrawn trilogy to eventually leader of the Imperial Remnant and beyond is really, really cool. And I think it's emblematic of the great things that were there in the connective tissue in the Bantam era, is even if the stories were still trying to find their ground a lot of times, they always pulled characters and they always made you feel like even when you read some of the worst stories, they mattered still to the characters' arcs. And yeah, they might retcon certain things with major characters, but there are a lot of good things in like Dark Saber, which is not one of my favorites, even if it is the best of the Callista trilogy. Excuse me. There's a lot of stuff in Dark Saber that works great for Pelion. There's a lot of stuff in Dark Saber that works great for a lot of different characters. And you read that trilogy and it stinks, but it actually matters for some of the characters overall. And so I do really love that about early EU. But yeah, I would say if you're getting rid of all those anybody who is canon by name only, and you're also getting rid of Mara Jade, um, then I would go with the Solo kids, Talon Card, and Pelion. Those are probably my 5 of my favorites. I'm trying to think of more while Sonic gives his answers.
He is a bit of a Gary Stu, Mary Sue, but I'd say Corran Horn. I really
Yeah.
do like him. I think the bones of who he is in the X-Wing trilogy is pretty solid. It's just sometimes it's like, man, he gets everything he wants, right? It's more later on when you limit him, and you're like, he doesn't have telekinesis. He's got to use force mind tricks, and he's got to become a great duelist and all that. That makes him a much more interesting character, even if he does start to get a bit used. I do appreciate that about him. Like I'm looking forward to like rereading Jedi Order and seeing his role in that story a little bit more. Because I don't know. I mean, even when I was a kid, I'd say Kip Duron, but there's no level of remorse with that guy sometimes. And yeah, you can say it's almost equivalent to Luke, right? But I don't know, man. I think he takes it a little too far. He goes a little too insane. Looking back at it, it really does pain me to say that Jedi Search, which is it's a fine novel, is the best of that trilogy. It kind of progressively gets worse for me. I only really like the emotional crux of him trying to save his brother, and then the tragedy of it happening in front of his eyes. But yeah, I mean, I'd go Corn for sure. I guess I would want a Kyle Katarn of sorts, but no matter what, Kyle would be very different. He didn't really fit with the Jedi Academy of the books. He was kind of tangential to it. The Death Star has been rewritten like 4 or 5 times in Legends about how they got the plans because there's like 25 different locations about parts of the plans, and, he was one of the more notable ones, but now we got Rogue One, which honestly, I'd take over Dark Forces just as a story, but I think you can take some really fun leaps with Kyle Katarn and really flesh out some of the things that are implied, but lost in the gaps between games like Jedi Outcast 2 and Jedi Academy, right? I think you could have some fun with that. I do like some of the stuff with Jaden Core, especially since he does kind of
Mhm.
get books that are like very late in the EU that are like just very strange and very sci-fi conceptually with cloning and all that. But it works in a way that I don't think the Thrawn trilogy never hits in the same way for me. I was pretty surprised by how they handle that stuff. So a big fan of that. Um,
There's
I
one
don't know if
that you haven't said
Illumia
that I skipped on purpose because I thought you would this would be the first person you said.
Yeah, yeah, it's
You
unfortunate. Yeah, at the end of the day, Kyle is fun. He is great, but it is Corn for me. That would be my one, and then I'm trying to think. I'm blanking on his name. I'm blanking. Who am I blanking on?
I thought you
Uh,
were gonna say Ulick Kildroma as your first,
yeah, I see that. Okay, that's where it gets complicated because then I'd start going into a huge rant here, and I don't necessarily think we have the time for that. Because man, I'll try to keep condensed as much as possible. KOTOR is so overrated when you realize that so much of that story is dependent on Tales of the Jedi, and then it overwrites so much of it. It's really KOTOR 2 that kinda stands on its own to me. KOTOR 1 is built off the bones of Tales of the Jedi. It literally had Bastila Shan be a replacement for Vima Sunrider. It could have been such a connected universe, and then they just forget it. But it has an incredible aesthetic. It has incredible depth in how it goes through hopping around the galaxy with limited technology and all that. And then somehow in 30 years, I'm supposed to say Eula Qualdrum and Exar Kun are like basically forgotten, and Revan and Malik come. Like, I don't know. It doesn't work for me unless we start building out a gap and all that. So I would say Ulick. I would say Ulick, but my problem with that is that nobody remembers anything about those comics because of how KOTOR kind of came in and took away all the storm of what the Old Republic era was. And Star Wars: The Old Republic has been going on for so long now, and it's the only active Legends content that when you think about Tales of the Jedi now, it is probably the animated miniseries that Filoni came out with, which is frustrating because I hope that it gets a season 2 so then you can explore some of these early stories told in the early Tales of the Jedi runs, but I don't think that's going to happen. I want Ulick, of course, I want Ulick, but then I'd also mean that I need XR. I don't necessarily care too much about XR in the same way, but they are so dependent on each other. They have such a very interesting dynamic, kind of being forced as master and apprentice by a force Sith ghost specter of sorts, right? It's really interesting. Do I think it would work into canon? I don't know, not with the timelines, being really, really worked out, and it pains me to say this, but I feel like once they eventually get to the Old Republic, they're not gonna care about Tales of the Jedi. They're just gonna jump straight into KOTOR, which bums me so, so much because there's so much that I think if you just push it to 100 something years, you can really blend and put together an incredible story from Tales to KOTOR to whatever works out of the Old Republic to Knight Errant, whatever the inspirations are, and then to the Bane era. But will that happen? No. And that's why I didn't want to say Ulick because he almost only works in the comic format. He only kind of works as this almost forgotten piece of Star Wars in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, uh, I don't think they'd ever do that in canon too, but I do think the character is a pretty great Legends
Yeah,
character and
he's fun.
XR. But yeah, I did research a couple of these to see if they were Legends only, and I did also reread your question, Critical Thinker, and you said primarily. So I think Bane works for that also. So if we're just talking primarily Legends, besides Thrawn, Mara, and Revan, I would say probably Bane is my favorite, and then Jason, then Plagueis, and then there would be a toss up for a variety of people. The other two solo kids, Corrin, Kyle is a good shout. Darth Treya, I really love. The Exile is pretty good. Darth Sion, I mean, Nihilus is awesome. So yeah, I mean, you have a whole world of characters there, and I would argue, like even like somebody like Boba Fett is primarily Legends in a lot of ways because a lot of his story is Legends only and not really in Star Wars canon. And then with like Luke's Jedi Academy, I would say one that I still think is super underrated. Not that many people talk about. Tanel Ka. I love Tanel Ka. She's awesome. But yeah, thanks for that comment as well. And Critical Thinker also says the solo kids in Corn Horn are my picks. Talent Card, Admiral Pelion and Ulick Kildroma are great too. Haven't gotten into KOTOR much yet, but yeah, Tales of the Jedi is super underrated. And having Ulick, XR, and Nomi in a season of an animated Tales or even their own animated show would be incredible, but unfortunately, the chances of them doing that are non existent. Never say never, but yeah, they're pretty low. Especially because, well, one, they're not part of canon at all, but especially because now they've established the Tales of the excuse me. Now they've established Tales of the Jedi is something that's going to pretty much just enhance characters we already know. And that's kind of unfortunate. I'd love it if they did like an homage episode, like instead of these being 15-minute episodes, maybe one that's 30 or 45 minutes. And it is like, this is your homage to Tales of the Jedi, the thing we got our title from, but they're never going to do that. But yeah, that would be pretty cool. So thanks for that question. Good picks as well. Anthony says, "Do you think the Mandalorians could be the new enemy of the Jedi post Rise of Skywalker?" That'd be really interesting. I don't think so because I think right now the Mandalorians, like I said earlier, are the face of Star Wars, and I think they would be used in more of a heroic role if they were in the Rey movie or any stuff post Rise of Skywalker. I think it'd be a cool twist. I don't necessarily see Disney doing that though. I think they could use them though as a primary faction or ally for Rey's new Jedi Order against whatever threat they face. If everybody's predictions are right about the connections that they're going to do for the Grisks and anything connected to Thrawn and the Chiss and the way they use that and maneuver that into a similar story around the Yuzan Vong, like we see in the original New Jedi Order. You need all the factions you can get to help you out, and Boba Fett is a part of those original stories. You might as well bring in the Mandalorians as a faction that helps out Rey and anybody who's standing against the foreign invaders. So I would love to see them a part of it, but I don't know if they'll be the main villains. But it would be a cool idea also to have maybe one rogue Mandalorian who starts a faction, kind of a similar Death Watch style story where the Mandalorians have a ideological split. And then you have one kind of mad Mandalorian terrorizing the galaxy, kind of akin to the Mandalorian Wars in some ways too. So there could be some cool references there if they ever do decide to do that post Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter what, Grogu's gonna be around this time period. It'll be very interesting to see if they age him up to like he is an adult, or it's like no, he's in his teenage years finally, or something. We still don't understand the aging quite yet. It does seem like he might have been carbonite frozen, and that is kind of what's changed the age for him. But yeah, I mean, I think he'd be the player. I would be shocked to see Din Djarin make it out of the Mandoverse at this point. And if he does make it out, I think he'd just be a hobbled old man, just content to live on his little house and let his son do all the work at this point. Um, but yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting because for so long that Jedi and the Mandalorians have fought for their history of over and over again, and then with this Rey's new Jedi Order possibly being in like a fractured galaxy that doesn't have a unified government or anything, the Jedi are kind of able to go around and be like everyone's wary of them, even though Rey has triumphed over the evil that is the Palpatine name by becoming a Skywalker by taking on that name. It'd be very funny if it is almost like she gets credibility because she's with Grogu, because she's vouched by these independent Mandalorians who might still have their own factions and all that, but the Mandalorians and the Jedi might be together. I mean, that just seems like a Favreau Filoni, toys playing in your room sort of idea that it feels like it'd be earned, especially after the Clone Wars, after Rebels, after what we've seen so far in Mandoverse. Will that happen? I don't know, but I think it would be pretty interesting to have them be allies so that whatever new allies enemies come, they'd be almost entirely original or something that would put test both of them and force their cultures to change. And maybe we start becoming a little softer in some Mandalorian ways, that not just through Grogu, but then we start to become a little bit more Old Republic warrior-esque Jedi again or something. It'd be interesting regardless of how it's handled, but it would it would be in my mind a great place to just make them outright allies, because nobody really wants to be, working in a unified government with either party.
Dan the Man says, "A Mandalorian season 3 left a horrible taste in my mouth. Looking forward to Ahsoka season 2, but I'm mainly looking forward to Sean Levy's Star Wars film to be the alien Romulus of the franchise." Is that the rumor right now that it's a horror movie? I think that's an
I don't
interesting
know. I don't
choice.
know if it's a horror movie. Do you mean more in the sense of like it'll go back to basics and still kind of evolve a lot of the plot points that have been like left behind by all the separate storytelling? Because I mean that is what Romulus does, right? It is a Alien standalone film between Alien and Aliens, but then it's also sort of a Prometheus and Alien Covenant sequel. If you mean like that, sure, yeah, why not? I think he'd be great. I know people clown on him. I think his direction is great. I'm still find him such a great director when it comes to Stranger Things. It's just that he's kind of worked on Free Guy and Deadpool, which are very Ryan Reynolds driven films that are not very facially rich, not great color grading, right? They're kind of just silly and over the top. I think if you give him a good writer, I think his direction would totally make that work. Like that one shot from season 4, that continuous shot of where they're like in the living room being fired upon, and they're trying to escape. Like that is great, great direction. And in the behind the scenes, he basically came up with that on the day of, and he like coached everyone through it, and they got it within like 4 or 5 tries, and I think that just only shows that he's great at action cinematography and direction. It's just he's working with some silly scripts for much of his career.
Yeah, he also directed Night at the Museum, which was
Yeah.
awesome as well. But yeah, let us know what you mean by that, because I have not heard if it's a horror movie, if that's what you're saying. But I would love to see a Star Wars horror movie. I've been talking about it forever, but I don't know if he's the right person for Star Wars horror. But if he has an idea, I don't think anybody needs to be boxed into a certain genre if they have a vision. But if it was, we're making a Star Wars horror movie, who should we hire? Oh, Sean Levy. That wouldn't be my first pick. but but if he was the one that pitched the idea, then cool. Anthony's commenting back on Critical Thinkers three favorite Legends characters, saying Star Killer, Vitiate, and Dirge. Those are all great picks. Ones we didn't name as well. Dirge especially. I love that pick. Skywalker's Academy says, I'm pretty dismissive of season 3. I know mixing Boba and Mando seasons made things not as good as they should have been. Yeah, it removed a big emotional plot point that should have been in Mandalorian season 3. Anthony says, have you read Darth Vader issue 50? It was really good. I have not read it yet. Have you read it, Sanak?
I have read it. Yeah, I mean, Star Wars 50 is a very strange way of telling a story. It's almost like I think Charles Soule came out and said Star Wars 49 is just that's the end of his run, and 50 is kind of like a fun way of looking at things from the High Republic, the sequel trilogy with Ben and Luke, and kind of that being the framework of the story being told, set after the run and still before Return of the Jedi.
And he's
But
done that
Darth
a
Vader's a
couple
lot.
of times, right? So far, he's done those like anniversary
Yeah,
issues where he's told a bunch of short stories in his run.
yeah. I I like it actually, Star Wars 50. I think I wouldn't have personally gone with that if they didn't make 49's last page, if they just said, like, "That's the end," right? But again, I still think that was a good issue over Star Wars 75 by Greg Pak, which I hated that final run. You literally have everyone with you know, I'm Kyron Gillen's run after they were scouring a show turn, hand in hand, Luke, Han, and Leia. They're like, yeah, like, let's go find a rebel base, right? And I'm like, that's the perfect end. I hated that final arc. I just have to accept it. But Darth Vader 50, it's a bit more straightforward. I do think some of it should have been stretched out with some of the vision stuff between and Vader and Palpatine because that is like the whole emotional crux of the run kind of coming full center, and it's not short, it's just it is a little confusing if you just kind of skim through it quickly. You have to kind of read it a little closely to understand that he's not like force projecting or anything. Palpatine is actually there and stuff like that. I do like the short stories that come out of it. The Ochi one is a little whatever. It's just like a coda of sorts, like a just a small little epilogue for that character with Vader. But I do like the Sabe stuff with it. I think that was a great story, and I do like the last one. I don't want to spoil it for Liam, but the last one is like a very, very sweet ending. I thought that was a nice like, man, like it makes you really think about like the entire saga. But yeah, I know some people are really mixed on the run as a whole. For me, after because I've been, like, reading them weekly and I keep on going back and rereading, I think people forget that comic book reader amnesia is such a real thing. Like, you could read something with how many storylines come out, and especially with Marvel, with how many crossovers they do, that you kind of forget what is the gist of the story. I still agree that the stuff around Crimson Reign was super messy for the Vader line. It just I didn't like it that much, especially since it had such a strong start. But I think everything starting from Hidden Empire, which again, unfortunately, there's no Hidden Empire tie-in to Darth Vader. You kind of have to read the Hidden Empire miniseries to understand what's going on there before you come back to the story of Darth Vader. But from that point onwards, Hidden Empire onwards, I do think it turns into a pretty satisfying story. It's still a little repetitive. I won't deny that. Vader keeps on fighting Palpatine. You're like, how many times? It's like instead of like that SpongeBob meme, it's like, how many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man? It's basically Palpatine saying that to Vader instead of old man, broken man, I guess. But I think the finale is good. I think it hits all the right notes. And if I would put them in tier lists, I think the Kyron Gillen 2015 run is an A tier. The S tier that is the 2017 Charles Soule run cannot be topped at this point. It was well made and it didn't overextend its stay, and it still had very unique arcs. This is like a very loose B tier, but I still think it's a B tier once you ignore some of the things about the crossovers just kind of being repetitive and redone with some slight changes in framing and perspective. It's not really a 50 issue series. It feels more like 35, 40. And I think if you actually sit down and read it, as messy as it is, I still think it does all the right things for breaking down Vader to the shell of a man that he is at the start of Return of the Jedi.
And Greg Pak's run was always going to have a hard time living up to the other two, not just because of the
Yeah.
quality, but when you do any type of ongoing, and you don't really have a trajectory when you're starting, then I think it is always hard to keep that momentum. I mean, how many comic runs, not just Star Wars, but anything over the years have we seen start really strong? Because Greg Pak's first volume is one of the best Vader comics ever, but then it gets more inconsistent after that. And I think that's what he keeps going back to, right? Is that first volume? He keeps connecting back to that because that's the story I'm sure he pitched. And then
Yeah.
there are all these other things in between. When you have an ongoing, you have to deal with all those things. And I think Soul and Gillen very much so benefit from the fact that they had 25 issues. They knew they had 25 issues. They delivered their stories in that format that worked for 25 issues and told complete arcs all the way through, and each one built off each other. And I think that's much more, that's a little bit easier than writing and going, God, we have to come up with something else for next for the next 6 months. We got to come up with another story. And what's the next story after that? And I know I want to end it here, but how do I tell the story in between? Oh my God, and
Yeah.
we have to connect to
Yeah.
Crimson Rain. That's yeah, that's can kill an ongoing. So as much as events are fun, I do think almost always they hamper ongoings. But thanks for that question. We only have about 5 more minutes left in our stream, everybody. So we're probably not going to be able to get into everything, but we appreciate all the comments. If you want to get some last ones in, if you're at the bottom of the chat, send in a super chat. We do answer super chats first come, first serve. If not, we will just keep making our way through the chat from the top to the bottom. And next up, we have Skywalker's Academy says Penn Pershing and Elia Kane should have been split up and sprinkled throughout season 3 of Mando. I agree with that as well. I think um, Mandalorian season 3 is just such a weirdly structured season. You have so many episodes that feel too short, some that feel too long. There's massive blocks of story for certain characters that aren't Mandalorian. Then you have other blocks of character stories or character beats that are very short and feel like they could have been spread out. You do have the elephant in the room and Grogu, so it is a weird one, and I think pretty much any and all criticisms of structure, even one projected towards the Pershing and Kane stuff, I think all are justified. Um, Anthony says, I think there should be a Star Wars event series similar to Marvel Netflix event series. Do you mean like Defenders? Is that what you're meaning? Like everything builds to one? I mean, I like the idea. It should be a lot better than Defenders was. But yeah, I think that's what they were initially planning on doing, but I think it's switched to theatrical now is their plan for it. We always kind of talked about the fact that their end game seemed to be that they were building towards this Thrawn conflict, and that was going to be a final series, whether it was season 4 of The Mandalorian, season 5 of The Mandalorian, or just a new show, like a New Republic titled show, or a show called Thrawn, or a show called Heir to the Empire. It always felt like they were building to that. I don't think they're building that to that now anymore in the New Republic stuff, but it doesn't mean it can't happen somewhere else. It's just gonna probably happen now theatrically for New Republic.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I don't know. I mean, I wanted a crossover miniseries. I think that would have been a great bridge for stuff leading into the film. I think I actually would have preferred that's like a way to bring back Boba, Mando, um, Ezra. Now that he's rumored to be in the Mandalorian and Grogu as well, that would have been a nice little bridge to connect him back with Jason and connect back with Zeb and everybody else and kind of set the stage for future seasons and then what Mandalorian Grogu is obviously going to deal with. Uh, that's that also runs into the same problem as Defenders, where it's like, is it really that important? Is it really that worthwhile of a crossover? The crossovers, even when they were pitched, even if I feel like there should have been more like genuine storylines between these shows, cutting in and out, they were always kind of pitched towards going towards this New Republic film and kind of being in their own little sub lanes, their sub fandoms. So yeah, even if I want a transition, like a bridge properly from season 3 of Mando and what's left, what's been brought back to the main galaxy with Ahsoka and where we've been left off with Book of Boba Fett, I don't think the characters that would be involved in those 3 film shows put together would necessarily make a good miniseries or event series. So yeah, it's a little unfortunate, but if you're saying, like, special presentations, I would love something for, like, a Rangers of the New Republic, just do that once, and, maybe that's your way of recasting Cara Dune, maybe that's your way of introducing Janito Gavankars, Iden Versio and stuff like that. Maybe Migs Mayfeld kinda comes back and becomes part of that group. I think there's a lot of ways to do stuff with the medium of Disney Plus. I still don't understand why people at Disney don't believe in the special presentations, because I still think that's some of the best ways to just tell comic stories, tell smaller stories, and, be watched if you want to, and, sit standalone for the most part. But yeah, that is the nature of how things are changing again.
Anthony says, "Happy October 1st to everyone." Appreciate that. I've been going on my horror marathon for a while already, but I'm very excited to watch another one tonight to really kick it off. Anthony also says, "Do you think we see Anakin in Ahsoka season 2?" Absolutely. I don't really see anywhere where the story is set in the way they're setting this story around Mortis and all the mysteries of that. I don't see there being any way in which Anakin is not involved.
Yeah. It's
Scott,
impossible. I think he's gonna be a bigger character, if anything, than he was in season 1.
yeah, I think he is too. I think they're going to center a lot of the story not just around Ahsoka's relationship with Anakin, but Anakin as like an actual character this time. I think we're
Yeah.
going to really see Force Ghost Anakin. Skywalker's Academy says, "I'll have to check that out." Talking about that video earlier. And then Anthony says, "What's your favorite Star Wars YouTubers?" Who is your favorite Star Wars YouTubers? Mine are Eckhart's Ladder, Corey's Datapad, Lore Master, Stupendous Wave, and Star Wars Explained. Well, that's a question that can get you in trouble nowadays, apparently. And to be honest, I don't really have any. I don't really watch any other Star Wars channels. I feel like I'm so focused on our channel that I don't really ever watch anybody else's. Um, but I used to watch a lot of those guys. I used to watch Stupendous Wave. I used to watch Eckhart's Ladder, and I used to watch Star Wars Explained. Those were probably the three I used to watch the most. But I don't know, I've never really been much of a lore person on YouTube. I kind of watch more for, like, entertainment and shows and stuff like that, and so, Star Wars if I watched Star Wars YouTube channels like that, it would more be so for the point of, like, looking up
Hmm.
a specific lore bit. Like, if I looked up something about a certain character and Star Wars Explains video popped up, I'd watch it, but I didn't really have one that I watched consistently, and I now that we run our own, I watch them even less than I used to.
Yeah, I still see Eckhart's Ladder. I know he works a lot with Corey's Datapad, and they do a lot of lives together, so I'm kinda hoping to transition to more of the TapCaf podcast that they have going on where they're doing book reads and stuff like that. But I think Eckhart's for me, I like it just because sometimes I just wanna be reminded about lore, and I think he has pretty good energy in his voice. Uh, I still love Hello Greedo whenever he does show up just because he is almost like an example of a Star Wars YouTuber who is an OG, and yet he doesn't fit into any box now, right? He's changed, he's grown, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll talk about things I care about in Star Wars, and if I don't care about it, okay, yeah." Like, he talked about the Acolyte, and he's like, I like some things about it. I thought it was pretty ambitious in some ways. It was a lot of flaws in other ways. That's about it. That's all I gotta say, right? And it doesn't sell views. He doesn't even care about his YouTube like that anymore because he is, I think, like a full-time firefighter or something now. But I still like whenever he has an opinion because it's so awesome seeing his trajectory from like just being such a huge prequel hater when he used to be more like skit faced in his a lot of his videos with that helmet and stormtrooper helmet, and then kind of playing a bit more of a character that just rages against the prequels to now being like, it'll never be my favorite thing. Episode 1 will be nostalgic to me, but the Clone Wars and stuff like that have, like, changed him, right? And I think that's what I like about Star Wars YouTubers when they can change, they can grow, they can, stay in their own lane, and they don't have to, like, fit into any one specific person's version of Star Wars, and I think he's one of the best examples of that. Dash Star turned Lore Star used to be like that for me, like, 10 years ago, just started complaining about everything. I just don't watch Star Wars YouTubers when they complain about stuff. It's like, I get criticism, but if that's your channel, it's not really a Star Wars channel anymore to me. That's just a rant, right? And even when we complain about stuff, we still try to ground it in something like filmmaking or this is the lore that, we're expecting because the High Republic books are so good and Acolyte doesn't really feel more than aesthetically High Republic. Like, that's kinda how we talk about Star Wars. I kinda just don't watch a lot of Star Wars YouTubers now because for the most part, if you complain, you make money, and I don't try to spend time with someone who's gonna be negative and make money off of me feeding into the negativity. That's why, we might not be the biggest channel, but the time that we spend here, I don't think either of us have, like, a negative day about what we're doing. We might be, like, burnt out. We definitely were at the start of last year for a good run there from, like, January to April, but it was never because, like, oh, we dislike something, maybe didn't reach the expectations we had, but, we still love Star Wars to the point where, like, we'll just regroup in a month or so, and I think a lot of people needed to do that. Some Star Wars channels, it is all-encompassing, it is heavy, it is hard. We know the reality of that. A break doesn't hurt, and we've done it. It's definitely helped us out.
Yeah, it does. But yeah, hope let us know what some of your guys' favorites are, because we appreciate hearing more about other people in the community. I mean, we want to connect to other channels in the community, but we also we have our fun group here, and we enjoy interacting with all you guys. Anthony Tiff says Doctor Doom being an alternate universe version of Iron Man is kind of silly, in my opinion. Doctor Doom will always be Victor Von Doom. Yeah, I'm waiting to see what they do with that. I'm a pretty big fan of Victor Von Doom. I love Fantastic Four. It's one of my favorite Marvel comics, and I'm not really sure about the way they're going. I think with the direction Marvel's headed, they haven't done anything yet to make me very optimistic that this isn't just a ploy to get people to be like, what the heck are they going to do with this? I got to see it. It's not, I haven't done anything yet that makes me certain that this is not just a marketing thing. But that being said, Robert Downey Jr. has been awesome for the MCU, and I trust his creative vision with where he's going to take the character. He's an Oscar-winning actor now. I think he's a great actor, and I think he can deliver a menacing, very non-Tony Stark-esque Victor Von Doom performance. I would still, in a lot of ways, very much so like this to be an alternate reality version of Doom. I don't want this to be our main Doctor Doom that's going to exist in the MCU forever, because I also don't want the MCU to just kill off Doom, which they're going, like, I don't really see any way in which Robert Downey Jr.'s Doom doesn't die at some point in one of these Avengers movies. So, because I don't think he's going to contribute to the franchise for another, 15 years again. So he's probably going to die as one of the main villains, and I don't want them to kill off Victor Von Doom. So if they kill off Robert Downey Jr.'s version of Doctor Doom, I hope it's the alternate reality version, and then that we get like a real version of Victor Von Doom after, who's also one of the main bad guys of Fate or the next saga, whatever the third saga is. And because Doom, to me, Doom is fundamental to the Marvel universe. Like Loki has become, that's kind of who Doom was before. Not the same in personality, but he's a guy who shows up in everything. He's a villain that's so big, he's a part of every story, and he is really the Lex Luthor of Marvel. And that's why I'm excited Lex Luthor is being introduced in this first Superman movie, even if he's not the main villain, because Lex Luthor is a character who should be in every Superman movie. He should be in every Justice League movie. He's a character who's so fundamental to the DNA of the DC universe that he really should have his fingerprints on everything. He's so powerful. He's got so many connections across the world and politics and everything. And Doom is the same way. As the leader of his own country, he's got so much sway over what goes on Earth, and he really should be a part of almost every story and every major story. So I think losing Doom this early, especially after only one Fantastic Four movie, a couple Avengers movies, if they never go back to him, will be a big mistake. But I think as a gimmick for now, with this whole multiverse saga, with how many different people we're going to be seeing returning, whether it's Chris Evans as Johnny Storm again, whatever we see with other actors playing different roles, and all these things coming in these next two Avengers movies with what's the Doom one called? Doomsday, right? Doomsday and Secret Wars. I think I'm okay with that for now.
Yeah. I at the end of the day, this is a lot of business decisions. Obviously, Kang, I don't think they did a lot of the groundwork right. I like that he did have a lot of appearances, and it took me a while to go watch Loki season 2, and when I finally did, it was just to lead up to Deadpool and Wolverine, which I still think needed a little bit more of the Loki connections, especially season
Mhm.
2, more so than season 1, but, uh, yeah, I mean, it's you can't deny it. The Jonathan Majors case put a huge dent in that, and the big show out movie for him was Quantumania, which I think he is definitely the best part of that film, but that's just not a good film. I think Quantumania could have been a real creative swing, and then it just became the CGI mess with no real characterization and, like, a very confusing framework of Scott Lang and his novel, and it's like, "Is this reality?" And it's like, "What?" Like, okay. It's such a weird film to think about. It doesn't I was hoping it would be a big step up from Ant-Man and the Wasp, which I found very frustrating as well. I think that's probably one of my worst of MCU films, but
Yeah.
it says something that Quantumania, I still found a little bit more enjoyment out of it, right? So, yeah, if you're a big hero for or villain for this era of the multiverse is mostly just a silly comic accurate, but silly, post-credit scene, and then gets defeated by very intelligent ants, of course, but, not really the most visually dynamic or appealing the way the film had gone out, and then you just have this underrated show in Loki that has the best appearances, but isn't really Kang the Conqueror.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were in a hole there. Uh, Regardless of this being gimmick casting or not, I think the discussions around Robert Downey Jr. has been mostly healthy for Doom. I know people are like, "This is just the way of ruining and that," but I just think that's Twitter talk. It's the same way as, like, Twitter can be so negative about things, but there's also people who are, like, toxically positive about stuff like The Acolyte being this perfect show and all that. It's just not social media is just not representative of what people are coming to watch, and, yeah, you can make the argument films like the MCU should be more creative and all that. I'm having some optimism with what I'm seeing from Thunderbolts and what I'm seeing from Brave New World for Captain America. It feels like we're kind of stripping away some of the Chapek era, just push out a project just because we have to have the project sort of feeling, and it feels like now there's a little bit more shape and direction coming into effect. So I hope that Doomsday and Secret Wars have been thought out in that same way. I haven't really been impressed by the Russo brothers have done since Endgame. Very visually bland directors, honestly. It feels like they were perfectly aligned with Feige and were pushed to their best with him, and everything since has been like Netflix drap and like Amazon Citadel. I saw some pictures for Electric State, which is based off of artwork from this guy who did a lot of stuff for Tales of the Loop RPG as well, and it just doesn't look right with the Russo style. So I'm a little worried about if they're like a little out of shape or not. But again, this was just putting the names out there that gets people like, oh, okay, like I'm excited, I'm ready. Like this is shocking. This is energy that we've been missing because Kang just hasn't worked out that same way. I still do think that Kang should be in the role here as like maybe the Beyonder or something. I don't know, just some sort of who's is it Molecule Man or something who is the second in command basically of the Secret Wars comic? Someone I don't know who is
It's
under
been a long
Doom.
time since I've read.
Yeah.
Are you talking about the original one or the newer one?
Which I mean, they're blending it together, so it doesn't really make a difference. But
Yeah.
I still think Kang needs to have a role past Loki season 2. I don't think that should be the entire wrap up. But yeah, I think you can do some really interesting things with like maybe bringing back a multiverse Thanos to then get that iconic spine ripping scene from Doom. I still think you can do stuff with Kang, even if he's not the main villain. This just feels like you're trying to streamline everything towards bringing the Fantastic Four, who have been for it to be an alternative universe anyways. I know people have been saying like, "Oh, I hate you 3000" and all these memes, and there's a lot of rumors that Spider-Man is gonna be a big player in a simultaneously filmed, uh, Avengers Doomsday and Spider-Man 4, and I know there's rumors that Sony are trying to, like, bring the Venom supervillain of Null, who is like the
Yeah.
Symbiote King, and then sort of trying to make Spider-Man 4 multiverse and trying to really push as much money that they can milk out of their Dead on Arrival Spider-Man universe without Spider-Man. It's a juggling act. There's a lot of things here that on paper I don't think make much sense. I know Spider-Man will always be a wild card because of the Sony situation, but if they can make that solid and acquiesce to some of Sony's demands and build this out and then have that soft reset where Fantastic Four, where Doom, that can be kind of changed or like all be in one streamlined universe. We get to go with just a full on college Spidey, early um or like late 20s, early 30s Spidey. I know there's a lot of rumor Tom Holland's getting the bank to play him for like another 10 years. I don't mind it. I don't mind it. I think this is just a way to, like, speed up some things, smoothen out some things, get excitement, and then we'll get the real versions. Like, it's I know that Sony has control of all the villains of, like, Carnage and Venom and all that until they give the rights to Marvel, but maybe after the Secret War soft resets, maybe we have a Von Doom and Fantastic Four and Spider-Man team ups and all this and that. But then in the same universe, we finally get to have Oscorp again and properly
Yeah.
work with stuff like that that are like so iconic and influential on not just Spider-Man, but like the entire MCU and all that. So it's a
Yeah,
lot of juggling pieces.
that was the original rumor before
Yeah,
Phase 4 started, was that Norman Osborn was the main villain on Earth, and then we were
right.
going to get a multiverse kind of space extraterrestrial side with Kang,
Yeah,
and they went away from the Norman Osborn stuff, and now we've you know gotten Norman Osborn back in No Way Home, which is honestly the best performance Willem Dafoe has given as the character. He's so
yeah,
good in that movie,
yeah.
but we need you know another Norman Osborn back, and I want to see that as well. But but yeah, I think Doom is just
What
too
is this
important to kill
decision?
off right away.
Yeah.
Like they need more Doom, and hopefully we get that. But to me, none of it matters as long as Madam Web is like the lead of the next saga, because she's the best character that we've ever had in any superhero movie. And I think her and the other three that I forgot their names because they're so good. Uh,
Craven, Morbius, of
yeah, oh well, Morbius, of course, too. Yeah,
course,
he should be the head. But I was talking about the three Spider Girls.
that are
Uh,
better than the 3 Spider-Man even though they never actually fight in the film and they're just running the whole time.
right, they got to have a big battle. That would really end the Sony verse well, and their battle's so epic, and a Pepsi sign falls on them, and they all get teleported to another universe, and that's when they fight Tom Holland. And then that would be, yeah, that'll be just epic. I can't wait for that. But thank you guys so much for watching our stream this week and enjoying all the conversation, and for sending in all your questions and comments. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you stay tuned for the rest of the content coming out across the week. Like I said, we're going to have our first versus tier list out tomorrow. It's going to be Star Wars versus Lord of the Rings, in honor of Rings of Power wrapping up this week. And also check out more of our content. We do have a review of Padawan's Pride also coming. And then we just got the review copy of Mace Windu and the Glass Abyss. So we're going to read that and try to get you that as soon as possible. And then working on Tears of the Nameless as well, but we didn't get that one early. So that one we'll be getting to you a little later. Thank you so much for watching this stream. Make sure you stay tuned for all the other stuff, and join us again next week for more Star Wars news and Q&A. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you guys all next week. Good night.